for a second to tell me whether it's working?
Yes, mate, I can see your screen fine. Yep.
Perfect, thank you. So today's talk is in two parts. The first, Daryl asked me to give an overview of AABR, what it does and how it does it, and how we can link in with community. And then there's the second part of the talk, which is, I suppose, based around some of the advocacy that AABR does in terms of encouraging integration of bush regeneration practices into Landcare, and also why doing that is quite important, especially in a time of changing climate. I'd also like to acknowledge volunteer before I start. I noticed there are a few AABR members from Queensland and other places in this talk. So hello everyone. I'll try not to embarrass you too much. So I'm president of AABR. I have been for about the last 3 years. Since I left government, I got back involved with AABR, but I was also president around the turn of the century. So I'm bookending my career as president. So AABR has been around since 1986. Bush regeneration was a fairly new activity at that point, even though there has been what we would now consider bush regeneration has been going on since the 1930s. The first bush regeneration project, as we would accept the definition of bush regeneration, happened in Broken Hill in the 1930s as a way to recreate the vegetation around the town of Broken Hill to cut down on dust. But bush regeneration was flourishing in the 80s. A lot of councils were setting up bush care programs, which is the local government version of Landcare. And there was a lot of interest in the community to manage, especially urban biodiversity at that point. The industry was still fairly nascent. There were paid bush regenerators. The only company that was running bush regeneration in those days was the New South Wales National Trust, which is still running a contracting arm in bush regeneration. But a group of people came together to discuss how bush regeneration could be promoted, and how we could collectively start promoting bush regeneration, getting more happening, and actually just better management of the bush overall. And at the time, there was discussion. I was at this meeting in 1986 at Field of Mars, and there was discussion about whether that organisation should be a representative body of the bush regenerators or the bush itself. And we decided to keep the logic as we're an association of people interested in the bush, but our main client was the bush. And so for the last 30 years, we've been advocating for better management of bushland, and doing that in a number of ways, which I'll get into a little bit later. So at the moment, AABR is going through a significant growth phase, both in membership and activity. So we are around about 1,500 members at the moment, which is the most we've ever been. It's tiny in comparison to Landcare, we admit, but it's only really been in the last 5 years that we've broken the 1,000 membership mark, and it's growing year on year by around 10%. And part of that is because of our new constitution, where we are encouraging branches to be set up in different jurisdictions around the country. So previously, AABR was based out of New South Wales. It was incorporated in New South Wales, but we had membership across Australia, but everything was done from New South Wales. The new constitution turns that on its head, and we are encouraging members in different states and territories to form their own branches, and the national body will help support activities in states and territories. At the moment, we've set up a branch in Victoria. We're looking at setting up a branch in New South Wales, where most of our membership still is. There are members in Tasmania who are very keen to set up a branch, but that membership is still fairly low at the moment, but they will probably merge with Landcare Victoria. And we've started having discussions in South Australia with our members down there. So the idea is that probably over the next decade, we'll be set up with branches across every state and territory. We did actually have a Southeast Queensland, Northeast New South Wales branch some time ago. but like a lot of volunteer-run organisations, it folded after a while. We still have a fair degree of membership especially in southeast Queensland, but we do have members throughout Queensland. The other things that AABR's been really working on and driving in the last few years has been our national accreditation program, which I'll go into a little bit later. Regen TV and other resources, so providing materials and information and knowledge to those who may want to use it. And more recently, targeting that information for specific demographics. We're a player, an actor with the UN Decade of Ecological Restoration. So most of the peak restoration NGOs in Australia have banded together into a group called the Restoration Decade Alliance. And we're working together to promote the restoration of ecosystems across Australia, both aquatic and terrestrial, and also to improve practice. And we're getting very involved with government bodies to try to encourage them to adopt practices that will result in a net year-by-year improvement in ecosystem health across their areas of influence. Essentially, what we're trying to do is to lobby and help governments match their rhetoric with what they're actually doing, which I know very rarely happens. The other things we're working up at the moment in terms of our increasing activity is our working groups and our training and education reforms, and I'll get into those in a bit more detail a tad later as well. So our national accreditation program. While AABR is an NGO, our advocate is the bush. So we have advocate for the bush, our client is the bush, and we want to see better bushland management. We do that in a number of ways. We work with both the volunteers who work in bushland, and that's land carers and bush carers in most particularly, but also individual landholders. But we also work with the bush regeneration industry. And the industry is also year by year growing. In different parts of the world, parts of Australia, it's growing at different rates, but there is more and more money from the data we can get going into professional bush regeneration, and is becoming more normalised across organisations. So while 20 years ago, virtually all bush regenerators were contractors, and so they'd be employed by councils or agencies or Landcare groups to do work. A significant part of the professional industry now are paid staff in organisations, land management organisations. And so there's most councils in New South Wales would employ bush regenerators. And I think that's probably the most advanced part of that industry, but also in Victoria and in parts of Queensland too, there are professional bush regenerators employed by agencies and councils. What we're trying to do with our accreditation program is to create a standard, a recognised standard of what makes a good bush regenerator. Part of the problem is anyone can call themselves a bush regenerator. Anyone can call themselves anything to do with ecological restoration, really. And the quality of work and outcomes for the bush varies incredibly. So AABR put a lot of work into developing a series of competencies, which were based on the national competencies as part of the CLM course, that individuals have to demonstrate to be able to become accredited. It's a fairly established program in some parts of Australia, again, particularly New South Wales and Victoria, but we do have accredited people in every state in Australia now. And part of what AABR is wanting to do over the next 4 years is to set up assessors in each part of Australia so that the accreditation system can grow. There are a number of employers now who insist that bush regenerators they employ need to be accredited or be able to demonstrate equivalent competencies. So we're finding that people find it easy just to become accredited. What we hope to do with the accreditation program ultimately is to improve the standard of the works being carried out, because again, it's not only the quality of the practitioners that needs to be ensured, but also the works that are being put out, the contracts. And this is probably an aside to the talk in general, but what a lot of people are saying is that there's a desire to do good bushland management, but the people who are the bushland managers, the councils or the agencies, often don't understand how to restore bushland. And so the contracts that are being put out or grant programs that are being put out aren't appropriate to be able to effectively restore the bush. And you've got examples like the Australian government post-bushfire were putting out significant amounts of money to be spent in a year. Now, irrespective of whether people are undertaking plantings or doing bush regeneration, we all know that it's impossible to get good outcomes in 1 year. So having people who are program designers and grant program designers being accredited to, I think will add to the value of the work that's being done. There's also a corollary for this recognition in that there's never going to be enough money for the environment. And so we've got to make sure that every dollar counts, it's most effectively spent. So communicating and educating. This was one of the first areas that AABR got into in the 1980s, that we realized that to have an enthusiastic workforce, both volunteer and paid, people had to know what they were doing. And so in the absence of courses at that point, there was one course in 1986, and that was run by the New South Wales National Trust. AABR started producing information sheets, graphics, which could be used as part of education programs. We ran workshops, we ran field trips, just trying to instill enthusiasm, but also the knowledge and confidence in people to start undertaking bush regeneration. And those early activities we still do. Our website is full of resources which are free to use. Some of these are developed when we have resources to be able to do them. Others were developed through grants. So, for example, 4 years ago, we started a project called Project FAB, which was First Aid for Burnt Bushland. And what we found was post-fire, a lot of groups were coming to us and asking how they should be interacting with the bush to make sure that it was regenerating and restoring in an appropriate manner, because there's all sorts of issues with weeds being able to establish after fire. And so we started a project which was in part information-based, and there are videos and information sheets on our website around Project FAB, but also it was a sort of like a speed dating service, and we were matching up qualified and experienced regenerators who would volunteer their time to work with Landcare groups on sites to break the back of the regeneration of the issues so that the sites would regenerate in an appropriate manner. We've had our newsletter, which is, I suppose, our flagship source of putting out information. That's been running since the 1980s, as you can see one on screen. Issued number 153, we're up to 160 now. I put this one up because we won the National Landcare Award a couple of years ago for Project FAB, the First Aid for Burnt Bushland. And in the newsletter, it's really trying to create a community, so people, no matter where they are in Australia, can feel that they are part of a cohort, they're part of a community of bush regenerators. And also we use it to showcase what's going on around Australia. We use it to showcase some of the latest science, opportunities, and just really help people share information about what they're doing, because there's so few avenues for people to be able to network across Australia with like-minded people doing similar work on similar areas. We've more recently broken into the social media. On the bottom left of the screen there, you'll see what do bush regenerators do. We created a series of a dozen or so short social media posts to really drive people back to the website to learn more. And it's worked out a treat, because this campaign has now been utilised not only by AABR, but a range of other NGOs, Landcare groups, Landcare networks, councils have been using this to try to build capacity within their volunteers as well. Regen TV, the top left of the screen, we've produced a lot of videos. There's over 150 videos now. Some of these are just talking heads at seminars, but there's also a number of specifically edited videos on different topics, methodologies of bush regeneration, some of the scientific concepts around bush regeneration, some examples of regeneration. And as funds have become available, we've also started producing, I suppose, mini documentaries. And so we've been able to score funding over the last 5 years to do 2 of these. The first was on the bush regeneration project around Broken Hill and the Barrier Field Naturalist Society in Western New South Wales. And the second of these was in relation to the degradation and restoration of the big scrub rainforest in northeast New South Wales. Now, yes, they are both New South Wales projects, but that's where the money was available, and we're very keen to look for ideas for these mini documentaries in other parts of Australia. But also, you know, if people, members or non-members, are keen to work with us to help find funding, we can actually produce documentaries. Like I would love to do a doco on the wet tropics. Some of the rainforest restoration up there has been pretty phenomenal. Working groups are one of the main areas where I think we can change the basis of knowledge. There's so many issues in the environment where people just get paralyzed by the complexity of problems. And I've seen this in government, working in government, where there's a whole lot of issues conflated together, and in the end, we just don't do anything. So AABR, over a number of years, has been setting up working groups to look at very particular issues. Those groups will analyse the issues, they'll bring in experts, and they'll form opinions, which they'll bring back to the AABR board or committees, from which we can then create policies, create information, educational resources and the like. And the working groups are the powerhouse of driving the practice of bush regeneration. They're also the main avenue for non-members to interact with AABR, because the issues that these working groups consider are not confined to the interests of AABR. They're pretty universal. And so we often have a number of non-members involved in these working groups to help inform us, because we know we're not the font of all knowledge. We need to be able to consider all opinions and all knowledge. But also it's a good way that I think we find we can create goodwill and relevance for AABR. And I think a lot of you would probably find this as well, that if you're a small volunteer-run, volunteer-driven organisation, the more goodwill there is towards your group, the easier it is to do stuff. If you've got to fight for everything, so much of your effort goes into that. While if you can generate a demand for engagement, that people want to engage with you, things happen more easily. And so we've been setting up these working groups. They tend to work at the pace of the volunteers, as with all activities that we do. But over time, they do generate new information, new knowledge, new practice, and new ways to integrate issues into bushland regeneration planning and implementation. So at the moment, our various working groups are the accreditation, so improving the standard of professional regeneration, or also volunteers. There's a number of volunteers who are accredited, myself included. Our branches are technically subcommittees. So we have our Victorian subcommittee, and hopefully soon we'll have our New South Wales one as well. We have a group which is the Chemicals and the Management of Biodiversity Management Working Group. This one came about a few years ago with the media frenzy around glyphosate. We formed a group to really look at the science around glyphosate, to give advice to land managers such as councils, but also we expanded it to look at the use of all chemicals in biodiversity management. So, and that gets down to even the use of fertilizers in revegetation projects. So how can chemicals be used appropriately to restore ecosystems? And that group has generated a lot of interest, a lot of membership from councils, for example, because most councils have come across issues around using glyphosate in particular in bush regeneration or bushland management. Education and training working group, we engaged very strongly with the TAFEs around Australia. In fact, the first CLM course, Conservation and Land Management course, which is now Conservation and Environmental Management, came about because of AABR. We obtained a grant from ANTA, Australian National Training Authority, to develop competencies for bush regeneration, and those were then worked into the first ever nationwide training for bush regeneration. And so AABR has had a place around the table since the 80s in development and delivery of the formal education around bush regeneration. And we do have 2 board members who are professional trainers in the TAFE system, and they help inform the board, but also take AABR advice back to the formal trainers. We've also been involved very much in informal training, so forums, seminars, field trips, and a lot of the informal training is member driven, especially the field-based work, but forums and webinars as well. Marketing and communications, so this is just promotion of bush regeneration. That's mainly just internal folk, as with the membership benefits working group. Our membership, I suppose, is predominantly based on people who join because they are passionate about the bush and they like what we do. They're not in it necessarily to get lots of benefits, but it is always nice to be able to give something back to members. Walks and talks. This is also related to training, but there's a lot of goodwill generated by running events, and this is one of them. We'd moved a lot to online delivery during COVID, and we keep on presenting to networks, Landcare, Bushcare, agencies, and the like. A new working group that we've started up not so long ago is our volunteer regeneration working group. And this is, I suppose, maybe of most interest to Landcare, in that while it's recognised that Landcare as a movement is both agricultural and biodiversity, there are a lot of Landcare groups that do focus on biodiversity management, especially urban Landcare groups. And there's a parallel system to Landcare. There are probably close to 200, and we don't know the exact figure, but probably close to 200 local councils around Australia that run their own volunteer biodiversity programs. And most of those do bush regeneration. And so AABR did have fairly good contact with these groups around 20 years ago, and we developed materials to help councils set up volunteer programs. And that relationship sort of dissipated over the years, and we're now looking at how AABR could work with all programs that are based on biodiversity management and utilising volunteers to work on biodiversity, to see what role we could take in helping improve standards, providing materials. As an example, we know that there's well over 150 bush regeneration videos have been produced by Landcare groups looking at bush regeneration techniques. And if Arbor could have stepped in earlier and say, could we work with you and create the definitive video, it would have saved a lot of work and resources from those other groups that all produce their own little thing. So we're looking at, are there ways that we could support groups as a whole? Are there ways that we can go for grants to develop resources? Are there ways that we can promote best practice amongst these programs? And our training and education reforms, I suppose, as I mentioned, we've had a long history of getting involved in formal training, and the move to the CEM course away from the CLM course. We were very, very involved with the development of that. And so hopefully as that rolls out across Australia, we'll maintain our involvement. There's a few myths about Arbor which I think it's worthwhile just touching on. I hear a lot that Arbor is just an industry association, and I suppose that is because people often see the work we do with the industry, because we do think it's very important that we do have a viable and vibrant bush regeneration industry out there, whether it's permanent employees in agencies or contractors. But it's not the mainstay of what Arbor does. Most of our membership is made up of volunteers, and just out of interest, just for interest, most of our professional bush regenerators are also volunteers. This is an interesting thing that most professional bush regenerators are passionate about what they do, and the majority of them who are members of Arbor do actually volunteer in a bush care or Landcare group as well. So we are trying to improve the industry. Part of the reason too is that a vibrant industry helps the volunteer bush regeneration movement as well. That what we've seen over the years is that the most successful restoration projects is where there's been integration of professionals and volunteers, where professionals can either break the back of an issue, they can hasten the regeneration, they can do the activities that might be more dangerous or more onerous, and letting the volunteers do what they can do best. And so there's so many wonderful examples right across Australia of that integration of professional and volunteers. So that's another reason why we want to see a viable and vibrant industry out there. But the majority of what we do in real life, and it's probably more hidden, is around supporting bush regeneration as a concept rather than any particular demographic. Similarly, that flows on. It's not just about industry, it's also not just about professionals. The accreditation program is about professionals mainly, but most of our education is geared towards volunteer programs. We've often heard that Arbor is elitist, and we wonder why, because like most volunteer organisations, we would work with anyone, and part of that is a confusion that's quite dominant, and we've got to overcome this. That our membership is about accreditation, that you need to be a well-qualified, well-experienced person to join Arbor, and that is not the case. Anyone can join Arbor. It's just the accreditation is a recognition of your skills. And so most of our members are volunteers, they're not accredited. They're people who are passionate about the bush. They're people who join because they want to do something in their local community and feel they have the backing of Arbor to provide the information and knowledge to help them along in their pursuits. So yeah, we would love to see membership, and we also love to be influenced by members. We can't. Australia's a big place, and our board's only 11 people, so we need to rely on our members to help drive the agenda of the organisation. That relates to the standards to join Arbor are really high. The standards to become an accredited are, but anyone can join. And we don't do anything. We hear that a lot. And part of that is because people don't look. Part of it is because we are limited by the amount of effort that volunteers can put in to generating materials and activities. But, effectively for the amount of people, the number of people who volunteer, the output of work is phenomenal. I've been involved in, when I was in government, I was involved in supporting different NGOs and volunteer programs around New South Wales. And what I see is AABR punches way above its weight for the size of the organisation and the number of people who are active volunteers. So it's true that we could do a lot more with when we had more. And what we are hoping to do over the next a couple of years is put more effort into obtaining grants so we can actually do more, especially in parts of Australia where we haven't been particularly active. So how do we engage with the community? So I've touched a bit about our genesis. So the genesis of AABR was from community bush care volunteers, bush regeneration volunteers. And still most of our members, most of our board members are volunteers. A lot of the materials we do generate are open access. In fact, all of the stuff we generate is open access. And you see AABR materials, not necessarily branded or acknowledged, but we see AABR generated materials popping up all over the place from agencies, councils. I've actually seen a lot of guidance material put up by Landcare groups that uses our stuff word for word and our pictures, and sometimes acknowledging, sometimes not. We've got a focus at the moment on Landcare and local council engagement. Now, our engagement with Landcare is still relatively nascent. We're still working our way into working out how we can work better with Landcare, mainly because of our own resource constraints. But we think, especially with the impacts of climate and extreme weather, the methodologies of bush regeneration are absolutely necessary to be integrated into Landcare as much as possible. And I'll be going into that in a few minutes' time. But I've had talks with all of the, CEOs of the state and territory Landcare organisations, at least introducing AABR and talking about how we could engage better with their networks. And part of this is going to be talks like this. So, potentially over time, we could do a series of talks around techniques, methodologies, and some of the issues of bush regeneration that are relevant to Landcare. And also, we're looking at going for grants with different Landcare organisations to do demonstrations, trials, develop materials. And similar with the local council engagement, that's mainly around at the moment the two prongs. One is encouraging them to support volunteer bush regeneration programs, but also in terms of the quality of those programs. Most of our education and events program at the moment is based around community regeneration sites. So COVID put a stop to a lot of the activities that we were running in the field, but we've started running those again, and every single one of those we've run over in the last year, which has been around 18, have been in partnership with community bush regeneration projects, and often with councils or agencies as well. So it's bringing together all players and looking at using those field trips to both generate interest in the broader public, but to also drive membership of those volunteer groups. And the feedback we've had so far is very good. And we're now getting a wait list of community groups that want to work with us to to do field trips in their patch of the world, which is really good. AABR's also created a series of policy and position statements. So our advocacy role, because our membership is volunteers and our board is volunteers and I'm a volunteer, we're limited in what we can achieve. So we've got to go for the highest bang for the buck outcomes. And part of this is creating the truth, the small t truth about what way things should be. And so we've developed a number of policy and position statements, which can be picked up by anyone to argue their case. So we know that some of our statements have been picked up by community conservation groups, by council staff, by Landcare groups, to go to decision makers and say, look, you should do this in a certain way, and here's our evidence. So basically, AABR's opinions are being used to help bolster community groups engaging in decision-making processes. And this is one other area where I think we would love to be influenced. And so having some ideas sent to us about issues that we could create policy statements on. For example, we did one last year on roadside vegetation because of an AABR member in southeast Queensland who was concerned about the way that vegetation was being managed in roadside reserves and weed infestations in roadside reserves. So we came up with a policy statement triggered by a particular event, but that's now being used by community groups all over the place. And the other way that we're looking at engaging with community is going in as partners in applications for grants. If we can add some gravitas to an application, if we can help on the technical side of projects, especially if they're demonstrations, we would love to partner with organisations. And we don't necessarily want to be the drivers of those projects. We not necessarily after money, but in a couple of cases, we have done small projects, $10, $15, $20, $30,000. We've done projects where the community have wanted us to run it because they didn't have the infrastructure to manage it, but they were the implementers. So a bit more on AABR, what guides us. So in terms of our what we would consider bush regeneration, we follow the national standards for the practice of ecological restoration of Australia, put out by the Society of Ecological Restoration Australia. AABR was one of the authors of this document, and it's widely accepted. It was done as a collaborative project, and a lot of NGOs and also agencies were involved. Landcare was also part of this through Landcare Australia. So in terms of what AABR's planning to do over the next little while, we're going to continue to advocate for the implementation of better practice restoration. So we're finding avenues to engage with decision makers, most particularly, but also empower people across Australia to advocate to their own local decision makers. So we're trying to just really push that, especially in light of SOE, the State of Environment 2021, which showed we're going to hell in a handbasket from a biodiversity perspective. What we're doing now isn't working. We've got to do things better. We want to set up branches. I would love to see branches in Queensland, ACT, New South Wales, and Tasmania in the very short term. In the medium term, in South Australia and WA, where there's also a bit of regeneration going on. The territory is probably going to take a bit longer. We realise, with our capacity that we do better when we collaborate with other organisations, and this is one reason why we have started discussions with state and territory Landcare organisations, but also with groups like government agencies, Trees for Life in South Australia, conservation councils in each state. We really want to push our accreditation program and get assessors set up in each state, and we're revising the program to make things happen faster, better, and more logically. And we want to particularly tackle bush care, local government run bush care programs. While Landcare has an infrastructure, there are regional networks and there are state organisations, most council run programs aren't well integrated and they don't talk to each other, and people do feel a bit more isolated. So if we can help bring together in some way all the council run programs in particular to improve their enthusiasm and their practices, we'll continue to do that. So what can you do? Join AABR. We'd love to see membership grow. As members grow, we can do more in those areas, or people can do things on behalf of AABR. Become active in a subcommittee or working group, whether you're a member or not. Please, if you've got expertise, if you've got ideas, if you've got the issues, come to us and work with us. And really identify where and how you can become an influencer. That if you can use AABR materials, AABR policies, AABR advocacy to help drive your agenda, please do so. Membership, if you've got your phones ready, you can just do the QR code. Membership's not that expensive, it's $35 a person, but also groups can join. So we do have quite a number of Landcare and bush care groups and members of AABR. What do you get out of it? You don't get anything more than if you weren't a member. You could still use any of our materials, irrespective of membership. But what we hope is to the more members we get, the more resources we can create, because we are volunteers, so all the money that's generated through membership goes into increasing our capacity to do more. So we always do encourage individuals and groups to join. So the second part of the talk, very quickly, why we want a renewed focus on bush regeneration and Landcare. Climate and extreme weather is demonstrating that the damage to bush is quite likely nowadays in drought, flood, fire. Projects like Project Phoenix, done by Greening Australia, have shown that there's a growing constraint around seed supply because of climate change. We think that facilitated natural regeneration is great in Landcare because it does actually take less work than a lot of planting projects and has better biodiversity outcomes. Bush regeneration means different things in different parts of the world. We accept a definition from the SARA guidelines, which it's a facilitated natural regeneration that uses the resilience of ecosystems, and you introduce activities that undertake activities that encourage the natural regeneration of bush. The methodology understanding why the bush degraded in the first place, and you mitigate those degradational factors. And it's quite systematic in early years, but in general, it's not rocket science, and it results in very good biodiversity outcomes. Just for context, this is the spectrum of interventions and what sort of bushland management happens. To the left, you've got spontaneous regeneration. We've all seen that after a bushfire, bush comes back. Facilitated regeneration, which is where most bush regeneration happens, is where there's some degradation which needs mitigating, and that might mean changing soil nutrients, reintroduction of fire, removal of weeds, and then the bush can recover. As we move further to the right, the bushland is more degraded and may require some reintroduction of plants, and so we've probably all seen isolated remnants where some species have gone extinct. The bush might be regenerating nicely, but we need to reintroduce species. And then at the far right is reintroduction or reconstruction, where areas are so degraded they have no capacity to recover by themselves. And so it's essentially a revegetation or landscaping. The reasons for integrating bush regeneration into your programs, and we do acknowledge, by the way, I know that there is a lot of bush regeneration happening in Queensland. Some parts of the country, it's not happening through Landcare so much. There tends to be much more revegetation, but I do acknowledge that there is a lot of regen happening in Queensland. So why integrate bush regeneration? It's lower maintenance, so it's less work. The resilience, so these areas that are recovered through regeneration are more resilient to the natural disasters and extreme weather. It's able to better migrate into adjacent areas. So you can actually have cores of bushland that have been regenerating into degraded areas. And the bushland is better able to adapt to a changing climate. I'm not saying drop everything you're doing and do bush regeneration, but I think where you can find areas to introduce regen techniques to complement current activities, it's well worthwhile. I won't go into this because I'm way over time, but there's a whole lot of climate change issues that are impacting on ecological and biodiversity management, and these are just going to get worse as time goes on. So how do we integrate climate change considerations into Landcare biodiversity projects? One of the things that was quite apparent from the decade from hell that we went through with the drought, then fires, then floods, then mouse plagues and other things was that a lot of Landcare sites were damaged or totally destroyed. And a lot of groups lost significant enthusiasm because a lot of their effort disappeared. They made all this investment in time and emotion and resources, and they were damaged to the point where a lot of groups actually folded. So in terms of climate change, prioritising sites, I think, is an important one, that finding sites that do have resilience and to extreme weather. And so by bolstering that resilience, they're less likely to degrade. Building climate risk into project designs. So understanding that projects may fail because of extreme weather. This has been done often before with, say, riparian projects where people know that there's always a risk of flood, but integrating that risk management approach into flood, fire, drought, I think means that when damage does happen, it was expected, and you have ways to manage it, that you know this is part of the risk of doing the job. And that is just anticipating the worst. And if the worst doesn't happen, you can maintain enthusiasm. One area which I think Landcare has a great opportunity is taking advantage of climate change. The significant drought in the last decade reduced the impact of a lot of weeds. A lot of weeds died, especially in the wetter areas, and gave access to areas that usually would have been impenetrable. And so, for example, in New South Wales, where I live, in the mid-north coast, with the drought, a lot of the lantana died off. And so we had access to areas where we could actually then treat the resprouting lantana, and we're able to eradicate it from huge areas because we took that climate change opportunity. Same with fire, just use the opportunities to be able to jump in and quickly do work that will save you a lot of time in the long term. If you're doing vertebrate pest control, drought and fire is fantastic too, because it really reduces the pest species populations. And so you can potentially, with less resources, eradicate locally a whole lot of weed and pest species. The other stuff is just general. You can look at this later on because I know I'm going over time, but just integrate climate change into your planning and monitor and adapt, and just make sure that you're building landscapes that are resilient to the change. Okay, that's the end of the talk. I know the last bit was rushed, but I'm more than happy to come back and give a more in-depth climate change talk. The QR code there takes you to our website, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Peter, for an awesome presentation. And folks, feel free, if you want to turn your cameras back on now, and feel free if you've got questions to stick your hand up or type them into the chat. We did have one question typed into the chat, Peter, that I might go back to, and now I've just lost the chat off my screen, but here we go. So Sarah asked the question with the accreditation program that AABR runs is whether it's similar to the TAFE accreditation, i.e. the cert in conservation and land management. How do they sort of fit together and how do they compare?
One of them, the TAFE is a qualification and you get a certificate, while accreditation is an accreditation of your skills and knowledge. And so you can't just come out of TAFE with your book learning. It's how you apply that knowledge to restoring ecosystems. And so basically to get accredited, in reality, you need to have been working for 2 or 3 years at least to understand how knowledge is applied to practice.
And in terms for those who are looking to get into this as a profession, how do they compare then for, in terms of employment opportunities and that sort of thing?
Look, it varies incredibly around Australia, and what also varies is the remuneration. Bush regeneration contractors. Look, when I was at university and working as a bush regenerator, it was the best paid casual work you could get. We were getting paid 2 or 3 times more than being a waiter. Nowadays, that has reduced significantly. Part of that is because, and I'm sure Spencer could jump in here as actually an employer, and also Mark, but the expenses of running a business now are much higher than they were in those days. So things like work health and safety and the like have meant that salaries haven't risen as fast as could have. So it's still a fairly well-paying job. It's very healthy. You're out in the bush. There's opportunities in different parts of the state. So, different parts of the country, depending on the amount of contract work, if you work as a contractor, or whether councils or agencies are employing bush regenerators. So in Southeast Queensland, I'm pretty sure Redlands and Brisbane City employ regenerators. Most of the councils on the New South Wales coast employ regenerators. One of the main problems as a career is that there's no long-term career path. So at the moment, there's a disjunct between the trade of bush regeneration, so the field work, and how to then jump into management in terms of, say, being a bushland manager or an ecologist in council, because one is regen's a trade qualification through TAFE, not a university qualification. So part of what we've raised in with our education and training group is how do we create the link between field work as regenerators and then being able to move in, after you get your bad back, how do you then get an office job with the council planning bush regeneration projects, for example?
Yep. Very good. All right. Helen's made the comment, would love to discuss invertebrate pest control at some stage in the future. So maybe when you come back and do that, talk about bush regen and climate change, mate. We could also touch on the invertebrate pest control.
Yeah, please stop sending your fire ants down towards New South Wales.
Very good. And Francis has made a comment about fire being the biggest concerns. It seems councils and states are keen to give grants where they can count the trees planted, but at the same time, hearing that we can expect major fires and only lip service being paid to managing the fire risk associated with that.
That's true. One of the things I didn't enter into in terms of climate change considerations is we've all got to take into consideration whether or not our activities are making the situation worse. And so revegetation in particular has got to be placed in such a way and structured in such a way that it doesn't exacerbate fire risk to people or to infrastructure. And a lot of the general activities of, say, grants that give out for tree planting, it's going to be decades before there's enough resilience that those areas can survive a fire. And so this is why I think in terms of prioritisation, if groups are mainly concerned about biodiversity, if they can bolster the resilience of the biodiversity in their patch and then allow for that natural spread of bushland from those areas, even if it includes planting, you'll find that planted areas next to bushland get that resilience to fire much more quickly than if you're just going to a greenfield site miles from anywhere. Not saying those greenfield sites don't need doing, but it's part of the risk matrix. The other area where Landcare can actually exacerbate issues is flooding. So lower catchment revegetation without upper catchment revegetation could actually slow water down in the catchment and prolong peak flows or peak flood levels, while strategically revegetating upper catchments and especially restoring wetlands in upper catchments can actually reduce peak floods downstream.
It hurts my head to even think about the insurance implications of both fire and floods in those scenarios, Peter. So as if volunteer groups don't have enough to deal with already. So,
yeah.
Hey, Peter, it's been a tremendous presentation. I really enjoyed it. Lots of great information shared there. We've had a lot of people who have stayed here right to the end. So thank you, everybody, for staying to the end. Some great questions as well along the way and some great comments. I'm pretty sure we might like to get you back at some stage, Peter, to finish this conversation. So I'll let you and Daryl sort out when and how we do that. But thank you so much once again for a great presentation. Thank you to everybody for coming along, and we look forward to the next one next month. Thank you to QWalk as well, of course, for putting these online forums on. It's always a tremendous resource, and I really enjoy coming along and doing them. So thank you. Go well, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, and happy for people to contact me through other.
Of course. Thanks, Peter.